The midday sun over Oakhaven didn't just shine, it punished. The air was a thick, suffocating blanket of alkaline dust and flies, but the crowd gathered outside the Crimson Keg Saloon didn't care about the heat. They were transfixed by a spectacle of pure cruelty. Tied to the heavy oak hitching post, right in the filth where horses relieved themselves, was a woman in a shredded, mud-caked wedding dress. Her white veil hung in tatters around a face bruised by rough hands, her wrists bleeding against the coarse hemp rope. Standing over her was Silas Thorne, the ruthless leader of the Ironwood Syndicate, laughing as he raised a bucket of dirty, stagnant water and poured it directly over her head. The crowd chuckled nervously. In Oakhaven, you either laughed at Silas's cruelty, or you became the target of it. Silas gripped her chin, forcing her face up toward his sneering grin. "Look at you!" he mocked, his voice carrying across the silent street. "Abandoned by your cowardly groom, traded to me to pay off his gambling debts. You're nothing but dead weight. Tell me, girl, can you even cook? Or are you completely useless?" From the edge of the square, a lone cowboy named Caleb Vance watched through the shadow of his Stetson, his hand resting inches from his worn Colt revolver. If you saw a woman treated like an animal, would you walk away to save your own skin, or would you pull your iron and sign your own death warrant? Evelyn spat a mixture of blood and muddy water at Silas's boots. She looked past him, her piercing blue eyes locking onto Caleb. When she spoke, her voice didn't tremble. It rang out with a chilling, quiet authority that silenced the entire street. "I can cook a meal that will make a man remember his mother," she whispered. "Or I can cook a poison that will make him meet his maker. It depends entirely on who is sitting at my table." Silas froze, his smile vanishing, but before he could strike her, Caleb Vance stepped out into the blinding sun. The silence that followed Evelyn's words was heavy, broken only by the dry wind rattling the tin roof of the livery stable. Oakhaven was a town built on broken promises and shallow graves, a dying mining settlement where the law was whatever Silas Thorne decided it was on any given afternoon. The local sheriff had been buried 6 months ago, and no one had been foolish enough to pin on the tin star since. The Ironwood Syndicate ran the territory with a casual, predatory violence that left the townsfolk hollowed out and terrified. Caleb Vance had ridden into this godforsaken valley only 2 days prior, looking for nothing more than a fresh horse and a quiet corner to mend his own broken spirit. He was a man chiseled from old regrets and hard miles. His duster was stained with the red dirt of 3 different territories, and his eyes held the weary, dangerous look of a wolf that had survived too many traps. For years, Caleb had lived by a single, survivalist code: never get involved in another man's fight. In the Wild West, curiosity didn't just kill the cat, it left your carcass to be picked clean by the turkey vultures. Yet, as he stood on the perimeter of the dirt square, watching the water drip from Evelyn's ruined white lace dress into the thirsty dust, something cracked inside his hardened exterior. He saw the sheer defiance in her posture. Even tied to a post, soaked in filth, her spirit wasn't broken. She wasn't begging for her life, she was issuing a promise of vengeance. Silas Thorne recovered from his momentary surprise, his face darkening with a cruel anger. He raised a heavy, leather-gloved hand, intending to backhand Evelyn across the jaw for her insolence. "That's enough out of you, you mouthy viper," Silas snarled, his fingers curling into a fist. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," a voice called out. It was low, gravelly, and carried the unmistakable weight of absolute certainty. Silas stopped his hand midair, blinking against the glare of the sun as he turned his head toward the source of the interruption. The townsfolk parted like a school of minnows avoiding a shark. Caleb Vance walked slowly down the center of the street, his spurs clicking a slow, rhythmic death march against the hard-packed earth. His hands hung loose at his sides, his right palm hovering just an inch above the walnut grip of his single-action army revolver. "And who the hell are you?" Silas asked, his eyes narrowing as his 2 hired gunfighters, a pair of greasy-haired brothers named Buck and Jed, stepped up behind him. their hands instinctively moving to their holsters. "This ain't your circus, stranger. This woman belongs to the syndicate now. Her high and mighty fiancé Julian gambled away $500 of our money at the roulette table last night. He didn't have the coin, so he signed over his property, his horse, and his lovely new bride before escaping out the back window. She's my property now. A human soul isn't a poker chip, Thorn," Caleb said, stopping exactly 15 paces away. It was the classic distance for a killing. The air felt charged, thick with the scent of ozone and impending violence. "And Oakhaven might be a lawless hole, but I don't care much for men who hide behind ropes and buckets of water to feel big." Silas let out a loud, barking laugh, though his eyes remained cold and calculating. He looked Caleb up and down, taking in the frayed cuffs of his duster and the ancient leather of his gun belt. "You think you're a hero? You think you're going to ride in here and save the damsel? $500 is the price on her head, Calb. You got that kind of coin in those dusty pockets? Or are you just looking to get buried in our potter's field?" Caleb didn't blink. He reached into his vest pocket with his left hand, deliberately keeping his right hand free. He pulled out a heavy, velvet pouch and tossed it onto the dirt halfway between them. It landed with a dull, metallic thud. "There are 25 double-eagle gold pieces in that bag," Caleb said softly. "That's $500. Exactly what the coward owed you. Take the gold, untie the lady, and we'll call it a day." Silas stared at the pouch, greed warring with his pride. He was a wealthy man, but real gold coin was hard to come by in the territory. He gestured to Buck, who walked over, picked up the bag, loosened the drawstrings, and peered inside. Buck looked back at Silas and gave a slow, affirming nod. "It's real, boss. Minted in San Francisco." Silas smirked, stepping away from Evelyn and walking toward Caleb. "Well, look at that. A romantic fool with a deep pocket. You just bought yourself a wife, stranger. But let me tell you something." Silas leaned in close, the stench of cheap whiskey and tobacco rolling off him. "You better keep her on a short leash. She's got a bite to her. And if I ever see your face in Oakhaven again, I won't just take your gold, I'll take your skin." "I was planning on leaving anyway," Caleb replied, his voice entirely devoid of fear. "Untie her." Jed drew a bowie knife and sliced through the hemp ropes binding Evelyn's wrists. The moment she was free, she didn't collapse or cry. She stood up straight, rubbing her chafed, bloody skin, her eyes never leaving Silas Thorn. She memorized his face, every line of cruelty etched into it. Then, she turned and looked at Caleb. "Can you walk?" Caleb asked her gently, his demeanor changing completely from a cold killer to a protective guardian. "I can do more than walk, Cowboy," she said, her voice steady despite the ordeal. "I can ride. Let's get out of this wretched hive." As Caleb led his horse over, assisting Evelyn into the saddle before mounting behind her, the townsfolk watched in absolute, stunned silence. They had just witnessed a miracle, but everyone in Oakhaven knew the truth. Silas Thorn never let a grudge go, and gold coins only bought you a little bit of time. As they rode out of town, heading toward the shimmering heat haze of the high desert, Caleb looked back. Silas was standing on the porch of the saloon, a dark silhouette against the sun, watching them like a vulture waiting for a wounded animal to collapse. The journey into the high desert was an agonizing test of endurance. The sun beat down mercilessly, baking the clay flats into cracked, white sheets that reflected the blinding light back up into their eyes. For the first 3 hours, neither Caleb nor Evelyn spoke a single word. The only sounds were the rhythmic creaking of the saddle leather, the heavy, rhythmic breathing of the stallion, and the occasional dry hiss of a rattlesnake slithering beneath the sagebrush. Evelyn sat in front of Caleb, her back rigid, refusing to lean against him for support despite the exhaustion that must have been tearing through her muscles. Her ruined wedding dress fluttered in the hot wind, a surreal, ghostly white sheet against the endless expanse of brown and red earth. Caleb kept his eyes trained on the horizon, occasionally checking their back trail. He knew the desert better than most men. He knew that out here, the heat could play tricks on your mind, making you see riders where there were only cacti, or making you miss the real danger until it was too late. By the time the sun began its long, crimson descent behind the jagged peaks of the Dragoon Mountains, Caleb turned the horse down a hidden, rocky ravine. At the end of the canyon stood a small, isolated homestead. It was a modest cabin built from rough-hewn pine logs, flanked by a small corral and a deep, stone-lined well. This was Caleb's sanctuary, a place he had built with his own 2 hands to escape the ghosts of his past. It was a place where nobody knew his real name, and nobody asked about the notches on his gun. He dismounted heavily, his boots sinking into the dust, and offered a hand to Evelyn. She looked down at his calloused palm for a long moment before accepting it. Her hand was small but firm, her grip surprisingly strong despite the raw, red rings around her wrists where the ropes had bitten deep. "Welcome to what's left of my peace," Caleb said, his voice raspy from the dust. "There's a well over there. Water's sweet and cold. Go wash the grime of Oakhaven off your face. I'll tend to the horse." Evelyn nodded, walking toward the well with a slow, deliberate grace that seemed entirely out of place in the wild country. Caleb watched her for a moment, admiring her resilience. Most women from the East, and judging by her speech and her dress, she was definitely an Easterner, would have collapsed into hysterics after what she had been through. But Evelyn moved with the quiet dignity of a queen in exile. Inside the cabin, the air was cool and smelled of cedar and old paper. While Evelyn washed at the well, Caleb lit a single oil lamp, casting a warm, amber glow across the simple room. There was a stone hearth, a sturdy oak table with 2 chairs, a small iron stove, and a narrow cot in the corner. It was a lonely man's home, devoid of any feminine touch or decoration. A half-hour later, Evelyn stepped through the door. She had washed her face and hands, and she had used a pair of Caleb's heavy shears, which she found by the well, to hack off the ruined, mud-caked bottom half of her wedding gown. Now the dress hung just below her knees, revealing sturdy leather boots. Her dark hair, previously pinned up in an elegant bridal style, now fell in loose, wavy cascades around her shoulders. Without the mud and the veil, her beauty was striking, but it was a dangerous, sharp sort of beauty. "You look more like a desert survivor now," Caleb noted, sitting at the table as he cleaned his revolver with an oily rag. "I am a survivor, Mr. Vance." "Caleb Vance?" he replied, not looking up from his work as he clicked the cylinder back into place. "Well, Mr. Vance, you threw away $500 in gold today for a woman you don't even know," Evelyn said. Walking over to the small iron stove and looking at the meager supplies Caleb kept on his shelves. "Why did you do it? Men in these parts don't usually act out of Christian charity." Caleb paused, his thumb resting on the hammer of his Colt. "I didn't like the look of Silas Thorne's face. And I didn't like the idea of a woman being used to pay off a coward's debt. Let's just say I was paying back an old debt to the universe." "You don't owe me anything, Evelyn. I owe you my life," she said firmly, turning to look at him. "And I don't like being in debt. You asked me in town if I could cook." Silas thought it was a joke. "I wasn't joking." She began moving around the kitchen with an efficiency that surprised him. She found a sack of cornmeal, a slab of salted pork, some dried beans, and a small tin of wild mountain herbs Caleb had gathered. Within minutes the cabin was filled with the rich, intoxicating aroma of sizzling fat and boiling spices. Caleb watched her, fascinated. The way she handled the kitchen knife was precise, almost surgical. She didn't cook like a dainty housewife, she handled the utensils with a strange, intense focus. When she placed the wooden bowls on the table, Caleb took his first bite. The flavors exploded across his palate. The pork was perfectly rendered, the cornmeal cakes crisp and savory, the beans infused with a smoky, rich depth that he had never managed to achieve in all his years of solo cooking. It was a meal that felt like a memory of home, a warmth that seeped into his bones and made him forget, for a brief second, the harshness of the frontier. "You really can cook," Caleb breathed, genuinely impressed. Evelyn sat across from him, her eyes reflecting the flame of the oil lamp. "As I told Silas, a meal can be many things depending on who sits at the table. To a friend, it is life. To an enemy." She let the sentence hang in the air, a dark promise. Before Caleb could respond, the stallion in the corral outside let out a sharp, anxious whinny. The sound cut through the quiet night like a gunshot. Caleb's instincts, honed by years of violence, screamed at him. He blew out the oil lamp with a single puff of air, plunging the cabin into pitch-black darkness. "Stay down," Caleb hissed, his hand already gripping his holster as he slid out of his chair and crept toward the shuttered window. Through the narrow cracks in the wood, Caleb scanned the moonlit ravine. The desert was bathed in a ghostly silver light, casting long, distorted shadows across the rocks. And there, moving silently through the sagebrush at the entrance of the canyon, were three distinct silhouettes on horseback. Silas Thorne's scouts had tracked them. The sanctuary was no longer safe. Caleb stood frozen by the window, his breath slow and measured. The moon was high, casting an ethereal glow over the landscape, making the approaching riders look like specters rising from the desert floor. He knew exactly who they were. Silas Thorne didn't send his whole gang for a scouting mission. He sent his trackers, men who could follow a whisper through a sandstorm. "There are 3 of them," Caleb whispered into the dark room, his voice barely audible. "They're splitting up. One's taking the high ridge to the left, the other 2 are coming down the main wash toward the corral. They think we're asleep." He felt a soft movement beside him. Evelyn had crept up to the window, her breath warm against his shoulder. In her hand she held the long, heavy carving knife she had used to slice the pork. Her knuckles were white, her eyes wide but entirely devoid of panic. "Can you use that?" Caleb asked, nodding toward the blade. "If they get close enough, I'll open them up like a sack of grain," she whispered back, her voice tight with an icy resolve. "Let's hope it doesn't come to that. Stay here. Don't make a sound unless the door flies open." Caleb slipped out the back door of the cabin, moving like a shadow across the rocky ground. He didn't draw his revolver yet. The flash of gunpowder in the dark would give away his position to the riflemen on the ridge. Instead, he pulled a long, wicked hunting knife from his boot. He kept close to the log wall of the cabin, blending into the deep shadows cast by the overhanging roof. The first rider, a lean, rat-faced outlaw named Miller, dismounted near the corral. He held a repeating rifle in his hands, his boots making a faint crunching sound in the gravel as he approached the front porch. He paused, listening for any sound from within the cabin. He didn't realize Caleb was standing right behind the heavy water barrel just 3 feet away. With explosive speed, Caleb stepped out of the darkness. His left hand clamped over Miller's mouth, stifling his scream, while his right hand drove the knife deep between the man's ribs, finding the heart with terrifying precision. Miller stiffened, his eyes bulging in the moonlight, before going entirely limp. Caleb lowered the body silently to the dirt, catching the rifle before it could hit the ground. The second rider in the wash noticed the sudden absence of his partner's silhouette on the porch. "Miller? You see something?" he called out in a harsh whisper. Receiving no answer, the rider drew his pistol and began to spur his horse forward. But Caleb was already in position. He raised Miller's repeating rifle, aligned the iron sights with the rider's chest, and squeezed the trigger. The gunshot shattered the desert silence, a brilliant tongue of flame lighting up the night. The bullet struck the rider squarely, lifting him clean out of the saddle and dumping him into the sagebrush. Instantly, muzzle flashes erupted from the high ridge to the left. The third outlaw, the sniper, was firing down at the cabin. Bullets splintered the porch posts, sending showers of pine needles and wood chips over Caleb as he dove for cover behind the stone well house. Inside the cabin, Evelyn didn't scream. Instead, she did something Caleb never expected. She grabbed his old Winchester rifle from the wall rack, a weapon he hadn't told her was loaded, and thrust it through the gun port in the window shutter. She didn't fire wildly. She waited for the flash of the sniper's rifle on the ridge, timed the interval, and fired a single, well-aimed shot. A sharp cry echoed from the rocks above, followed by the heavy, tumbling sound of a body rolling down the steep gravel scree. Then, silence returned to the canyon, heavier and more suffocating than before. Caleb stood up from behind the well house, his heart pounding against his ribs. He walked back into the cabin, relighting the oil lamp. He looked at Evelyn, who was standing by the window, the Winchester rifle still pressed against her shoulder, a thin wisp of smoke curling from the barrel. "You're full of surprises, Evelyn," Caleb said, taking the rifle gently from her hands. "That was a 70-yard shot. In the dark. Most lawmen couldn't make that hit." Evelyn sank into a chair, the adrenaline finally leaving her body, causing her hands to tremble slightly. She looked up at him, her expression hollowed out by a deep, ancient grief. "My father taught me how to shoot, Mr. Vance." He was Judge Harrison of the Territorial District Court. Caleb felt a cold chill run down his spine. Judge Harrison? The man who was hung from the bridge in Silver City 3 years ago. He wasn't just hung, Evelyn said, her voice dropping to a whisper. He was murdered by Silas Thorne. My father was building a case to hang Silas and his entire syndicate for land fraud and murder. The night before the trial, Silas's men dragged my father out of his bed and executed him. The local authorities called it a vigilante action and closed the case. They were all bought and paid for. So you're wedding to Julian. It wasn't a romance. Caleb realized, the pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place. Julian was Silas's accountant. Evelyn confessed, looking directly into Caleb's eyes. He was a weak, greedy man. I targeted him, made him fall in love with me, and agreed to marry him just so I could get close to his ledgers, the documents that contain the proof of everything Silas has done. But Julian got cold feet last night. He realized I was using him, and he realized Silas was suspicious. So he gambled away his money, used me as collateral to save his own skin, and fled. I came here for justice, Caleb. But instead, I got humiliated in the mud. Caleb leaned against the table, rubbing his face with his hands. He had thought he was saving a helpless bride. Instead, he had walked right into the middle of a blood feud between a judge's vengeful daughter and the most powerful outlaw leader in the territory. Silas knows you have the scouts, Evelyn said, looking out the window at the dark desert. When these 3 don't return by morning, he will bring the whole gang. 10, maybe 15 men. They will burn this cabin to the ground with us inside it. You should take your horse and ride, Caleb. This isn't your fight. Caleb looked at the 2 dead men in his yard, then looked at the fierce, unbroken spirit of the woman sitting across from him. He thought about his own past, the years he had spent running from his own sins, refusing to stand up for anything. I'm tired of riding, Evelyn, Caleb said softly, his voice hardening into iron. And I never did like leaving a meal unfinished. We stand our ground. The morning sun rose like a bleeding wound over the horizon, painting the desert in violent shades of crimson and orange. Caleb and Evelyn didn't waste a single minute of the daylight. They knew the clock was ticking. By his estimation, Silas Thorne would realize his trackers were dead by midday, and it would take him until dusk to gather his full force and ride out to the ravine. If we're going to survive a siege, we need ammunition, Caleb said as they stood in the yard, checking their supplies. I've only got 40 rounds for the Winchester and 2 dozen for my Colt. That's not enough to hold off a small army. There's a neutral trading post about 5 miles north of here, at Blackwood Ridge, Evelyn suggested. The man who runs it, Weaver, sells goods to everyone, outlaws and honest folk alike. He won't care who we are as long as we have coin. Weaver's an old fox, Caleb warned, hitching his stallion to a light buckboard wagon he kept behind the cabin. He loves gold more than his own mother. But it's our only choice. Put on one of my old shirts and a hat, Evelyn. We need to look like simple homesteaders, not a gunslinger and a runaway bride. An hour later, they were moving along the dusty trail toward Blackwood Ridge. Evelyn wore an oversized flannel shirt of Caleb's, her long hair tucked tightly under a battered Stetson. To anyone passing by, she looked like a young farmhand. But beneath the seat of the buckboard lay the loaded Winchester rifle, her fingers constantly brushing against the cold steel of the barrel. The environment around them felt increasingly hostile. The wind had picked up, howling through the jagged rock formations like a dying animal, kicking up swirling vortexes of blinding dust. The heat was oppressive, making the horizon shimmer and warp. Every shadow behind a boulder looked like an ambush. Every rustle of dry brush made Caleb's hand twitch toward his holster. When they arrived at Blackwood Ridge, the trading post looked abandoned. It was a sprawling, ramshackle building made of sun-bleached timber and adobe, surrounded by a high wooden stockade. A lone mule stood in the corral, its head hanging low in the heat. Caleb stepped into the dim, cool interior of the store, the scent of dried meat, kerosene, and unwashed wool hitting his nose. An old man with a long, yellowing beard and sharp, rat-like eyes sat behind a long wooden counter. This was Weaver. "Vance," Weaver said, his voice like two gravel stones grinding together. "Don't see you up this way often. Hear things have been lively down in Oak Haven. Some stranger shot up Silas's pride and took his woman." Weaver's eyes darted past Caleb, landing on Evelyn, who stood near the door, keeping her hat pulled low. The old man's eyes lingered a second too long on her petite frame and the way she carried herself. "I need 2 boxes of .44-40 cartridges and a keg of black powder, Weaver," Caleb said, his voice flat, stepping directly into Weaver's line of sight to block his view of Evelyn. "And I need them fast." Weaver slowly slid a pair of heavy cardboard boxes onto the counter, his fingers lingering on the brass ammunition. "That's heavy lead for a man who claims he's just farming rocks down in the valley. Silas Thorne is offering $100 in gold just for information on where that woman is hiding. 200 if someone brings her back alive." Caleb reached across the counter, his movement so fast Weaver didn't even see it. He grabbed the old man by his greasy suspenders, pulling him violently across the wood until their faces were inches apart. The cold barrel of Caleb's Colt pressed firmly under Weaver's chin. "You listen to me, you old rodent," Caleb hissed, his eyes burning with a terrifying fury. "If I find out you sent word to Silas, I won't just kill you, I'll burn this trading post down with you locked inside it. Do we understand each other?" Weaver swallowed hard, his yellow teeth chattering against the steel of the gun. "I don't know nothing, Vance. I swear. I'm just a storekeeper. Take the ammo and go." Caleb released him, tossing a silver dollar onto the counter. He grabbed the ammunition boxes and nodded to Evelyn. They walked out of the store, loaded the supplies into the buckboard, and turned the horses back toward the ravine. But as they drove away, Evelyn looked back through a crack in the wagon's canvas. She saw a young boy, no older than 12, slip out from the back of the trading post, mount a swift calico pony, and gallop furiously toward the south, toward Oak Haven. "Weaver betrayed us," Evelyn said, her voice dropping all color. "He's sending a rider to Silas right now." Caleb didn't look back, he just lashed the reins harder, forcing the stallion into a fast trot. "I expected as much." In this country, fear always beats loyalty. It doesn't change anything, Evelyn. It just means the storm is coming faster than we thought. We have about 3 hours before the horizon turns red. The ride back was a race against time. The dust storm was worsening, the sky turning a dark, bruised violet as the wind began to whip the sand into a frenzy. It was a classic desert gale, a blinding wall of grit that wiped away their tracks but also made navigation nearly impossible. By the time they reached the safety of the ravine, Caleb's face was coated in a layer of white dust, his eyes bloodshot and stinging. They unhitched the horse, hauled the ammunition into the cabin, and began barricading the windows with heavy oak planks, leaving only narrow firing slits. The atmosphere was thick, suffocating with tension. There were two people trapped in a wooden box, waiting for death to arrive on horseback. The dust storm died down as abruptly as it had started, leaving behind a deathly, unnatural stillness. The desert air felt heavy, pregnant with the scent of rain that would never fall. The sun was sinking low, casting long, bloody fingers of crimson light across the canyon walls, painting the rocks in shades of deep scarlet. It was a beautiful, terrifying sight, a red horizon that looked like an omen of slaughter. Caleb stood by the front firing slit, his duster laid across the table, revealing his two loaded revolvers and a row of gleam-filled cartridges lining his belt. He was meticulously checking the action of his Winchester rifle, ensuring that every mechanism was oiled and ready. Beside him, Evelyn was systematically arranging the ammunition boxes, her movements calm, deliberate, and entirely devoid of fear. "They're here," Caleb said quietly, his voice cutting through the silence of the room. Through the narrow slit, he could see them. Silas Thorne hadn't just brought a few men, he had brought his entire enforcement squad. 12 riders emerged from the shadows of the canyon entrance, their horses moving in a slow, ominous line. In the center of the formation rode Silas himself, flanked by his remaining top enforcer, Buck, whose face was twisted into a mask of pure malice. Instead of rushing the cabin, the outlaws halted their horses just outside of rifle range. Silas raised a brass spyglass, studying the fortified cabin for a moment before lowering it and shouting across the expanse. "Vance!" Silas's voice echoed off the canyon walls, amplified by the natural acoustics of the stone. "I know you're in there. And I know you got the girl. You killed 3 of my best trackers, and for that, your life is forfeit. But I'm a reasonable man. Toss the girl out the front door, along with your weapons, and I'll let you ride out of this valley alive. You have 3 minutes to decide, or we burn the place to ash." Caleb looked at Evelyn. The red light of the setting sun streamed through the firing slits, illuminating her face. She looked like a painting of a pioneer saint, beautiful, fierce, and entirely unafraid. "Would you trust his word?" Evelyn asked softly, her eyes searching Caleb's face. "Would you believe a snake promises not to bite? A man like Silas Thorne only honors a deal when it suits him," Caleb replied, his hand tightening around the stock of his rifle. "The moment you step out that door, he'll shoot me down and take you anyway. I've spent my whole life running from men like him, Evelyn. I think I'm done running." "What's the plan, then?" she asked, her voice steady. "We can't outshoot 12 men from inside this box forever. Eventually, they'll throw torches onto the roof." Caleb looked at the small iron stove, then at the keg of black powder they had bought from Weaver. A dark, dangerous plan began to form in his mind. It was a gamble, a desperate, suicidal play that required absolute precision. "Weaver sold us out, but he also sold us our victory," Caleb said, a grim smile touching his lips. "We're not going to hide in here like rats, Evelyn. We're going to invite them in for dinner." "What do you mean?" "Remember what you told Silas in town? That you could cook a meal that could make a man meet his maker? We're going to make good on that promise. I need you to prepare a feast. Light the stove, get the meat cooking, make the smell carry across the yard. And I need you to use that wild mountain root I have in the tin, the locoweed root. In high doses, it doesn't just cause hallucinations, it paralyzes a man's limbs within 15 minutes of eating it." Evelyn's eyes widened as she realized what he was suggesting. It was a psychological trap, a play on Silas's immense arrogance. "He'll think we've surrendered. He'll think we're trying to buy our way out with a meal." "Exactly," Caleb said. "Silas is a narcissist. He loves nothing more than seeing his enemies grovel. If he smells fresh food and sees the door wide open, his pride won't let him just shoot us. He'll want to sit at my table, eat my food, and mock us before he kills us. That's when we strike." Working with feverish intensity, Evelyn threw open the stove dampers, piling in cedar wood until the iron glowed with heat. She threw the remaining slabs of salted pork and dried venison into a heavy iron skillet, seasoning it heavily with the crushed, powdery locoweed root. Within minutes, the cabin was filled with the rich, mouth-watering aroma of roasted meat and savory herbs, a scent so powerful it drifted out through the open firing slits and across the dusty yard. Caleb walked over to the front door, unlocked the heavy wooden bar, and pulled the door wide open, revealing the brightly lit interior of the cabin to the outlaws waiting in the dark. He stepped onto the porch, his hands raised away from his guns, a white cloth held loosely in his left hand. "Thorn!" Caleb shouted into the twilight. "We know we're beaten! The woman wants to make a deal. She's prepared a final meal for you and your men. Come in, eat, and let's talk like civilized men before anyone else dies." Silas Thorne stared at the open door, the rich aroma of cooking meat reaching his nose, causing his stomach to rumble. He looked at Buck, a wide, arrogant grin spreading across his face. "Look at that, boys!" Silas laughed, his voice dripping with triumph. "The big, bad gunslinger turned out to be nothing but a dog looking for a scrap. Let's go see what the lady cooked for us." The night had fully descended by the time Silas Thorne and his men dismounted in the yard. The only light came from the warm, golden glow spilling out of the open cabin door and the brilliant, starry canopy of the desert sky. Silas walked with a heavy, confident stride onto the porch, his spurs jingling like silver coins. He was flanked by Buck and 4 of his most vicious gunmen, while the remaining 6 men stayed outside, guarding the horses and circling the perimeter. Well, look at this cozy setup," Silas sneered as he stepped across the threshold, his eyes scanning the small room. The heavy oak table had been pulled into the center of the room. On it sat a massive, steaming iron pot of venison stew, surrounded by platters of golden cornbread and a bottle of Caleb's finest rye whiskey. Evelyn stood behind the counter, her hands folded politely in front of her, her head bowed in a performance of perfect submission. Caleb sat in a chair by the corner, his gun belt hanging visibly from a peg on the wall behind him, seemingly disarmed and defeated. "Sit down, Thorne," Caleb said, his voice sounding hollow and beaten. "You won. The gold is yours, the girl is yours. Just let me take my horse and ride out when you're done." Silas pulled out the heavy captain's chair at the head of the table, sitting down with a grunt of satisfaction. He gestured for Buck and the other 4 men to join him. They crowded around the table like a pack of starving wolves, their eyes fixed on the steaming food. They hadn't eaten a hot meal in days, and the aroma in the cabin was intoxicating. "You see, Buck?" Silas said, scooping a massive portion of the stew onto a tin plate. "This is what happens when you show a man who's boss. They don't fight, they cook for you. Let's see if the lady's skills match her mouth." Silas took a huge bite of the meat, chewing thoughtfully. His eyes lit up with delight. "Goddamn, that's good. Best wild meat I've tasted in 5 territories. Eat up, boys. It's a celebration." The outlaws dug in with animalistic ferocity, shoving the stew into their mouths, washing it down with deep swigs of the rye whiskey. Evelyn watched them from the shadows, her face an unreadable mask of cold marble. She counted the minutes in her head, watching the rhythmic movement of their jaws. Every bite they took was another grain of sand falling through the hourglass of their lives. Caleb remained perfectly still in his corner, his eyes tracking the clock on the mantel. 10 minutes passed. The outlaws were laughing now, their voices loud and boisterous as they mocked Caleb and talked about what they were going to do with Evelyn back in Oak Haven. "You know, Vance," Silas said, his voice suddenly sounding a bit thick, his eyelids dropping slightly. I was thinking about letting you go. But I don't think I like you enough to do that." Silas tried to raise his glass of whiskey, but his hand trembled violently, the liquid splashing over his fingers. He frowned, staring at his hand as if it belonged to someone else. "What the?" "My hand feels like lead." Across the table, Buck tried to stand up, but his knees buckled instantly, sending him crashing heavily back into his chair, knocking over a plate of cornbread. Boss. Something's wrong. My legs. I can't feel my legs. The other 4 outlaws began to panic, clawing at their throats as a sudden, terrifying paralysis began to creep up their limbs. Their breathing became shallow, their eyes widening with a sudden, horrifying realization. Silas glared at Evelyn, his face contorting into a mask of pure, venomous rage as he realized he had been tricked. You bitch! You poisoned us. He tried to draw his revolver, but his fingers were completely numb, slipping uselessly against the polished ivory grip. Evelyn stepped out from behind the counter, her posture straight, her eyes burning with the cold fire of absolute vengeance. I told you in town, Silas Thorne, she whispered, her voice cutting through their groans like a razor blade. A meal can be life, or it can be a poison that makes a man meet his maker. Tonight you sat at the wrong table. In that instant, Caleb Vance moved like lightning. He didn't reach for the gun belt on the wall. He reached beneath his chair, pulling out a hidden, loaded double-barrel shotgun he had strapped to the underside of the seat. He stood up, leveling the barrels directly at the paralyzed outlaws. The men outside! Silas choked out, his voice a raspy whisper as the paralysis reached his chest. Shoot them! Shoot them! Caleb didn't give them a chance. He fired both barrels of the shotgun into the ceiling, the deafening blast shattering the windows and blowing out the oil lamp, plunging the room into a chaotic twilight illuminated only by the glowing embers of the stove. The 6 outlaws outside, hearing the double blast, assumed the execution had begun. They rushed toward the front porch, their guns drawn, crowding into the narrow doorway. But Caleb was already behind the barricaded counter. He picked up his Winchester repeating rifle and began to fire with a terrifying, rhythmic precision. Bang! 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 The bullets tore through the crowded doorway, lifting the outlaws off their feet and dropping them onto the porch planks. Evelyn stood right beside him, calmly reloading his empty revolvers and sliding them into his hands as he emptied the rifle. It was a perfectly choreographed dance of death, a gunslinger and a judge's daughter delivering a bloody, merciless sentence to the men who had terrorized the territory for a decade. Within 3 minutes, the gunfire ceased. The porch was a silent graveyard of fallen men, the smoke from the gunpowder hanging thick and white in the air like a burial shroud. Inside the cabin, Silas Thorne lay slumped over the table, unable to move a single muscle, his eyes rolling back in terror as Caleb Vance walked slowly over to him. A smoking Colt revolver held loosely in his right hand. Caleb looked down at the man who had ruled Oakhaven with fear. Your empire is over, Silas. The law has finally come to the valley. The morning sun rose over the Dragoon Mountains, its light no longer a bloody red, but a clean, brilliant gold that chased away the dark shadows of the night. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the clean scent of the high desert after a storm. Caleb and Evelyn stood by the buckboard wagon, which was now loaded with the lockboxes and ledgers they had recovered from Silas Thorne's saddlebags, the definitive proof of the syndicate's crimes that Judge Harrison had died trying to find. The surviving townsfolk of Oakhaven would wake up to a new world today, a world where the shadow of fear had finally been lifted. Caleb looked at Evelyn, his expression softer than it had ever been. What will you do now, Evelyn? The territory is safe, and your father's name is cleared. I'm taking these ledgers to the federal marshal in Tucson, she said, her blue eyes reflecting the bright morning sky. I'm going to finish my father's work. What about you, Caleb? Will you stay here? Caleb looked back at his quiet cabin, then looked at the endless, open trail ahead of him. For the first time in 10 years, the ghosts of his past felt quiet. He had finally stood his ground for something that mattered. I think I've spent enough time hiding in this canyon, Caleb said, a genuine smile touching his lips as he climbed into the driver's seat beside her. I think I'd like to see what else the world has to offer. And besides, I've grown quite fond of your cooking. Evelyn laughed, a sound that felt like the first rain after a long drought, And as they drove the wagon out of the ravine, leaving the empty graves of the Ironwood Syndicate behind them, the frontier felt a little less wild, and a little more just. Sometimes, the most dangerous weapon in the West isn't a gun or a knife, it's the quiet resolve of a soul that refuses to be broken. What would you have risked for justice in a land without laws,